Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. Arthur Bennett pulled himself out of his chair with difficulty, tearing himself away from insurance and endless reports. It had been a hard day at the office and he was relieved to go home. As always, he looked forward to a quiet evening, a delicious dinner, conversations with his wife, perhaps a game with his grandson the next day. Life flowed measuredly and reliably, exactly as he had always liked it. But already on the threshold Arthur sensed something unusual. The dim light in the hall, the light scent of Marian's perfume, her new hairdo and a dress he had not seen before. "I made us a reservation at the Jardine for 7, Marian said with a mysterious smile that made Arthur feel slightly uneasy. The Jardine was an expensive restaurant in the center of town, and Marian never made such dinners for nothing. Running through all the dates in his head on automatic, Arthur calmed down. No anniversary, no birthday, nothing he'd ever forgotten. He let her lead him into the bedroom, where he changed into his suit, feeling like a stranger in this sudden splendor. Marian looked marvelous, bright eyes, a smile slightly touched with lipstick. But despite her beauty, Arthur caught something troubled in her eyes. Her mood seemed elevated but tense, as if she were preparing to announce something important, and Arthur didn't know what to prepare for. At the restaurant they were led to a table by the window, and as soon as they were seated Marian stood still, as if gathering her thoughts. Arthur watched her alternately shifting the utensils on the table, and sensing that the tension was growing, decided to be the first to break the silence. "Well, darling," he said, trying to keep his voice light. "I think this is the moment when you must show your cards." Marian seemed relieved, but hesitated a few seconds longer before speaking. "Arthur, I want you to know. Bruce Morrison is back." The words echoed in Arthur's chest with a strange weight. The name sounded as if it came from a past he hadn't thought of in a long time. Bruce. Marian's first love, whom she had once dated as a girl. That, perhaps, was where their relationship with Marian began. He was the one who helped her forget the past and start a new life. "Back?" he asked, choosing his words carefully. "You mean, come to visit?" She shook her head, not averting her gaze, and he could see the worry in her eyes. "No. He's going to live here." "He bought a house 2 streets away," she answered in a whisper, as if she was afraid her words might disturb their stable family happiness. Arthur felt his insides tighten. He looked at his wife in silence, not knowing what to say. In all their long life together, he had never seen her so worried. And worst of all, he felt that this anxiety was not his, Arthur's feelings, but something else entirely. "We've seen each other," Marian began, and this time her voice trembled slightly. "He came last week, to tell me we were neighbors now. We were talking, reminiscing about school, and Arthur, I realized I had to decide something." A waitress appeared on the table to offer drinks, and Arthur nodded his thanks, trying to delay the moment of truth. When the waitress left, Marian, as if relieved of tension, got to the point. "I need a year, Arthur," she said, looking into his eyes. "A year to sort myself out, to realize what's really important to me. I love you, but I realized I still feel something for Bruce. Maybe I need to relive it all over again." Arthur felt an icy sensation coursing through his veins, leaving him simultaneously numb and horrified. Their 30-year marriage, his home, his family, it all seemed destroyed in an instant. He was silent for a long time, unable to find the words. He nodded, trying to suppress the jealousy and anger that flared inside him until he could say something. "Do you really think that's a good idea?" he asked, trying to keep a calmness in his voice that he didn't really feel. "Are you willing to risk everything for this meeting?" Marian put her hand on his, and the touch made him feel a stab of pain, for that hand, like all her touches, belonged to him, to his home, to their past. "I think it's better this way," she whispered, squeezing his palm a little harder. "Please understand, Arthur, it's not because I've fallen out of love with you. I just need time to understand myself. Will only be a year." He nodded slowly, even though he realized that this year could destroy everything they had been building. "Okay," he finally said, forcing himself to look her straight in the eye. "On one condition. For this year, I don't want to see you or hear from you. No calls, no meetings. If you've made up your mind to do that, then everything else must be left behind." Marian froze, but pulling herself together, nodded in response. "Thank you, Arthur, you'll understand, I promise. We'll be together again, you'll see." The words sounded almost like a sentence, and in the silence there was an emptiness between them that he had never felt before. Marian drained her glass of wine and moved closer to him in gratitude for his consent, but he pulled away, realizing that touch could not erase what had just been said. Back home, Arthur didn't go to their shared bedroom. He took the pillow and silently retired to the guest room, where he stayed until morning, staring at the ceiling and trying to realize that this wasn't all just a bad dream. Morning came and Arthur went down to the kitchen as usual, but he was greeted by the wrong house. Marion was dressing, packing her bags and marking her calendar. A round date circled with a bold line as a reminder of her temporary freedom. Arthur watched it with silent despair as she tried to cheer him up, assuring him that a year was but a moment. But in that instant Arthur felt he was losing her forever. Marion made breakfast and then, hiding her joy behind a formal smile, whispered, "I'll see you in a year, Arthur. Trust me, everything will be fine." Instead of answering, Arthur nodded silently, and his face froze in a stern expression as he heard a car pull up to the house. Bruce appeared on the doorstep, full of enthusiasm, eager to take Marion to her new life. Unable to remain a spectator any longer, Arthur went into the study, and when all was quiet, went upstairs, made a firm decision to change the locks on all the doors and start a new life. Arthur awoke to the faint morning light filtering through the blinds in the guest room, feeling tired in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. These past few weeks, his life had become an empty ritual: work, home, quiet, and work again. Without Marion, everything seemed meaningless. She wasn't at breakfast, she wasn't there to ask him how his day was going. Arthur did not immediately realize how strong this emptiness was. He didn't tell anyone about what had happened, not his friends, not his daughter Hannah, who kept calling and occasionally dropping by with her grandson. Hannah sensed that something was wrong, but her mother managed to convince her that it was only a temporary separation. A month passed and Arthur was beginning to adjust to his new life. One evening Hannah called. "Hi Daddy. How are you? Frank and I and the baby would like to come visit tomorrow if you don't mind." Arthur felt his heart clench. He knew he would have to say something. Taking a deep breath, he replied, "Sure, come over. I was just thinking it would be nice to see you." The next morning Arthur got up early, made coffee and began preparing the house for the visit. He wanted everything to look normal so Hannah wouldn't suspect anything. When his daughter and her husband and child arrived, Arthur met them on the doorstep, hugged her tightly and even tried to smile. Hannah noticed his change at once. "Daddy, you look tired. Is everything all right?" He waved his hand, hiding his worry behind a tired smile. "Just work, honey. Everything's fine. Where's Mom?" Hannah looked around, expecting to see her mother in familiar surroundings. Arthur knew this moment was coming and tried to speak calmly. "Hannah, let's sit down. We need to talk." They sat down on the couch and Arthur, lowering his gaze, began to explain. "Your mom? She left," he said, feeling his throat dry. Hannah looked at him in bewilderment. "Gone? But where? What?" "You see, Hannah," Arthur chose his words so as not to offend his daughter, but not to hide the truth. "She decided to take a break from our relationship. To renew an old friendship, with a man from her past." Hannah frowned and there was concern in her eyes. "You mean Bruce Morrison?" Arthur nodded, feeling his fingers clench into a fist. "Yes, Bruce. Her high school sweetheart, who seemed determined not to let her go until now." Hannah squeezed his hand. "Dad, I'm so sorry. That's a terrible thing to do. How did you even agree to this?" Arthur sighed heavily, staring into the void. "I don't know, Hannah. It just seemed better than losing her forever. She said it was only a year, and that everything would go back to normal afterward." Hannah shook her head, a look of determination on her face. "Daddy, you don't have to put up with this. It's not right. You deserve more than just being the one who sits and waits." Arthur grinned, but there was so much bitterness in his smile. "I know, Hannah. But 30 years of marriage isn't easy to forget. I still love her despite everything. Every day she's not around makes it harder for me." She put her hand on his shoulder and said softly, "We're all with you, Daddy. You're not alone." The rest of the day passed in a warm atmosphere. They talked and laughed, but something hung inexorably in the air. When Hannah left, Arthur returned to his lonely silence. Another week passed and one day Arthur, sitting in a local cafe, saw familiar faces on the street. Walking down the road were Marion and Bruce. They looked happy, holding hands. Arthur's heart clenched with pain. He felt like a stranger in his own town. He couldn't turn away, so much jealousy and anger pierced him. How could a man to whom he had given his whole life start a new one so easily? They walked away into the distance and Arthur stayed, staring into his cup, not noticing how his coffee had gone cold. Back home, he felt a growing restlessness that was impossible to shake off. He called his friend and coworker, Jerry, a man he trusted as himself. "Hey Jerry, can you meet me? There's something we need to talk about." "Sure, Arthur," Jerry replied, his voice full of sympathy. What's wrong? You're not usually one to complain, are you? It's a long explanation, Arthur replied. Why don't you meet me at Flynn's 7 o'clock? Okay. That evening they sat at the bar in the pub and Arthur told Jerry about his situation, trying to avoid details but expressing all the pain he was holding in. Do you really think this is only going to last a year? Jerry asked, listening to him intently. She said she'd come back, but every day I realize more and more that it might not. Bruce, Arthur sighed heavily, he's back in her life, and they seem to have found common ground as if they'd never parted. Jerry shook his head thoughtfully. Arthur, you can't sit back and wait. Don't you deserve better? I do, Arthur answered slowly. But you know, Jerry, I've given Marion my whole life. And frankly, I can't just cut her out. She was everything to me. Jerry put his hand on his shoulder. Arthur, you don't have to suffer. You're a man who's always been faithful, always been there for her. And if she doesn't appreciate that, maybe it's time to think about yourself. Arthur didn't answer, feeling the weight of those words weigh on his heart. He shook his head, pondering what he had heard, and stood up to thank his friend. Silence greeted him at home. His gaze fell on the calendar, where the beginning of the one-year break was marked. He had seen it once, marked with a bold line, like a promise, but now each day was becoming more agonizing, longer. A few more weeks passed in the same rhythm. One day he came across an open photo, he and Marion and Hannah on the beach, smiling, young and happy. That moment was real, and it seemed to him that nothing could ever come back. Arthur went to the phone and dialed Hannah. Hi, Daddy. She answered cheerfully. Hi, Hannah. I was just here to hear your voice. She smiled through the receiver. I'm so glad you called. Frank and I were just planning on coming over to see you. We're bringing our grandson. You need a little distraction, Dad. Arthur was silent for a moment, feeling something thaw in his chest from the warmth of her words. Thank you, Hannah, he said gratefully. I think this is exactly what I need right now. The conversation ended and Arthur felt light. There were so many unpredictable things ahead, but he knew that his family, though incomplete, would always be there for him. Another month passed. Arthur's life slowly began to level out. He changed his routine, working more to distract himself. But the thought that Marion and Bruce might have been together still weighed heavily on him. Trying to stay strong, Arthur decides to go on a business trip, which was long overdue, an excuse to change his surroundings and perhaps get a fresh perspective on his life. His boss, Mr. Barkley, offered to send Arthur to a conference in Chicago, and he agreed, thinking that a change of scenery would do him good. On the train on the way to Chicago, Arthur reflected on his situation, feeling heavy, but at the same time realizing that he needed to find a way to move on. The hotel Arthur checked into was hosting a buffet for conference attendees that evening, and he decided to stop by. Keeping to himself, he stood with a glass of wine watching the strangers. He was comfortable being alone until a woman approached him with a warm smile and genuine interest. Are you from the insurance business too? She asked, noticing his name tag. Arthur turned and saw a woman in her 50s, elegantly dressed, with soft features and a friendly look. She was domestically warm and not at all like the business sharks he was used to socializing with at such events. Yes, I'm in insurance, Arthur replied, smiling, slightly confused by her unexpected approach. Arthur Bennett. Nice to meet you, Arthur. My name is Julia Fields. I work in this field too, but more in real estate appraisal. Arthur felt his burdensome condition recede for the first time in a long time. He felt relieved to be talking to Julia. She told him about her work, and the conversation gradually turned to more personal topics. Forgive me if I seem nosy, she asked cautiously. But you seem a little, how shall I put it, troubled. A difficult period? Arthur hesitated, but then, sensing Julia's sincerity, decided to answer honestly. You're right. My wife and I, we're on a sort of hiatus, if I may say so. He grinned faintly, saying it aloud as if he were admitting something incredible. She had met an old acquaintance, and it had opened up new vistas that she felt she needed to explore. Julia nodded, looking at him with understanding. You know, sometimes breaks can show us what we're really missing, she replied softly, but they can also help us realize who we really are. His gaze lingered on her face, and he sensed that perhaps her words were what he needed to hear right now. Perhaps you're right, he nodded, thinking for a moment. I've spent so many years building our relationship, our home, that I've lost myself in it. Believe me, I understand. Sometimes you have to step away from the familiar to figure yourself out, she replied with a smile. That evening ended with a warm goodbye and an exchange of numbers. Julia may not have realized it, but she left Arthur feeling that he could still change his life, that he could still be someone for himself. Arthur spent the rest of the evening wandering around the city, looking at the lights and listening to the noise of the cars, feeling that he was back to himself, a man who was making his own way. The next day, back in the city, Arthur decided he could no longer stay in the same place. He went to a lawyer he had known for a long time, Mr. Goodman, for legal advice. Mr. Goodman was older than Arthur and had long since earned his trust. "Well, Arthur, tell me," Goodman began, peering over his glasses, "what brings you to me?" Arthur lowered his head, searching for words. "Marion. She asked me for a year's reflection, but it's too much like preparing for a breakup. I don't think I can forgive her when she comes back. I want to file for divorce." Goodman nodded, realizing the seriousness of the decision. "Are you sure that's what you want? I know 30 years of marriage is no small thing." Arthur sighed heavily, as if deciding to let go of years of life. "Yes, I'm sure. I think she's already made her choice. And if that's the case, I have to make mine." "I understand," the lawyer nodded. "Legally, the divorce will be in your favor, especially if you consider her temporary absence as a form of spousal abandonment. You'll be able to keep your assets, but the division of property may need to be discussed in more detail." Arthur, feeling relieved by what he said, nodded. "Yes, that's what I need. I want to close this chapter in my life." After talking to the lawyer, Arthur headed to the park and sat on a bench, contemplating his decision. Suddenly he felt a sense of liberation escalating. He was finally in control of his own life, instead of being held hostage to a situation he didn't choose. A few days passed and Arthur called Julia almost every night. They discussed everything from his marriage to her divorce, which had happened a few years ago, to their work and just about life. She was close to his heart and made life a little brighter. One such evening when Arthur was at home, the phone rang. It was Hannah on the line. "Dad, I've got news." She sounded excited and happy. "Frank and I have decided, we're having a housewarming party at your house." "Well, as in your house, now it's going to be ours." Arthur didn't immediately understand what his daughter was saying. Then he realized, Hannah and her husband were planning to move into their family home. "You want to move into the house where we lived with your mom?" he asked cautiously, a little surprised. "Yes, Daddy. This house holds so many memories. Besides, it's more suitable for a family with a small child." His heart squeezed for a moment. They had lived so many happy moments in this house. But he quickly realized that this place belonged to the past, a past that no longer made sense to hold on to. "Hannah, I'm happy for you. I think this will be a good home for your family," he replied, feeling the sadness being replaced by warmth. "Thank you, Daddy. We're happy you agreed." This conversation gave Arthur a sense of closure. It was as if someone was pushing him to let go of the past and start living for himself. Time passed, and the day came when Arthur felt relief for the first time in a long time. He realized that it was time to take a step forward. Over the past months he had learned one important truth. You can't sit around and wait for someone else to decide your fate for you. Arthur called Julia again, inviting her to dinner, feeling ready to let something new into his life. His and Marion's story had not yet come to an end, but he knew that the past was no longer dictating how to live his life. He walked out of the house and, feeling relief piercing him to his very bones, he finally realized that life was just beginning. It was a particularly snowy and frosty Christmas evening. Arthur had barely parked in front of his daughter's house before the snow had time to block the driveway. It was the second time he'd been here in a few months, and he was still getting used to his new role as a visitor rather than a landlord. As he'd promised Hannah, he'd agreed to spend the holiday with his family for the sake of his little grandson, despite the presence of Marion and her companion, Bruce. Arthur sighed heavily, trying to prepare himself for what awaited him. Finally he knocked on the door, and after a few moments it was opened by Hannah. When she saw her father, she glowed and threw herself around his neck. "Papa, I'm so glad you've come," she said, hugging him tightly. "I know this isn't easy for you, but it's so important to me and the baby." "It's okay, Hannah," Arthur replied, hugging her back. "I'm here for you. Everything else doesn't matter." Hannah smiled, realizing that he was doing this for her, and led him into the living room where everyone else was already gathered. There was a Christmas tree in the room, decorated with many colorful lights and toys, and neatly stacked presents underneath. Garlands hung on the walls, and the smell of pine needles and freshly made cookies lingered in the air. When Arthur entered, his gaze fell at once on Marion, who was standing by the window, wearing a dark green dress and talking to Bruce. They noticed him almost immediately, and Marion smiled, though there was a noticeable strain in her eyes. "Hello, Arthur," she said softly, coming closer. "I'm glad you could make it." "Thank you, Marion," he nodded, trying to keep a low profile. He turned to Bruce, who was standing behind her, with a clear challenge in his eyes. "Bruce, Arthur nodded, trying to remain calm. Arthur, the man replied reservedly, raising an eyebrow slightly. His expression seemed haughty and confident, as if he were the master of the situation. Arthur realized that Bruce no longer saw him as a rival, but simply as a husband on pause. Hannah broke the silence by clapping her hands and announcing that it was time to open the presents. "Let's all sit down. Let's start with the baby gifts," she said enthusiastically, picking up the infant in her arms and drawing everyone's attention to the new member of the family. Arthur sat down on the couch watching his family. His heart clenched with longing and a sense of loss. What had once been his home now belonged to the past. He pulled himself together, deciding, as he had planned, to end this evening formally but with dignity. When Hannah presented the first presents to little Tom, smiles lit up the faces of everyone present. The little boy, of course, was not yet aware of what was happening, but he was delighted by the bright colors of the wrapping and the glitter of the Christmas lights. This moment made Arthur forget his anxiety for a moment. After all the presents were handed out, it was Arthur's turn. He looked carefully around at those present, lingering his gaze on Hannah and then finally on Marion. "I have presents too," he began, pulling several neatly wrapped boxes out of his bag. He handed a small gift bag to Hannah and Frank, and they opened it happily, finding the key to his old house, now given to them. "Dad, this means you." Hannah couldn't believe her eyes, and Frank stared at the keys in a daze. "Yes, it's your home now," Arthur nodded, feeling relieved at his decision. "You and the baby will be more comfortable there than in your apartment. It's your property now." Hannah shrieked with joy and rushed to hug her father, tears welling up in her eyes. "Thank you, Daddy. You don't know what this means to us." When the joy had subsided a little, Arthur turned to Marion. He took a small box out of his bag and handed it to her. "This is for you," he said, trying not to look her in the eye. Marion took the box, a look of surprise on her face. She opened it carefully and saw a thin gold bracelet with the inscription, "Thank you for 30 wonderful years, Arthur." "Arthur," she whispered, shocked. "It's very beautiful, but—" Arthur nodded, not letting her finish. "I would like you to keep it as a reminder of what we shared. It was our marriage, our family. But now I want you to know that I'm letting it go. Letting you go." Marion's eyes filled with tears. She tried to utter words of gratitude, but her voice treacherously trembled. Bruce, noticing the confusion on her face, came closer and put his hand on her shoulder, as if he were trying to assert his claim on her. "It's all right, darling," he said, but his voice sounded irritated. "Don't be dramatic." "Dramatize?" Arthur could barely contain his bitterness. "I don't think you realize, Bruce, that bracelet is all that's left of 30 years. The silence that followed those words hung heavy. Hannah shifted her gaze from her mother to Bruce and then to her father, clearly unsure of how to respond. Bruce squinted and turned to Arthur. "Well, since you're willing to let go of the past, Arthur, maybe you should stop getting in the way. Marion deserves some happiness." Arthur grinned, but there was deep pain in his eyes. "You think I was in her way? Well, maybe. But you know, Bruce, I don't think you'll ever know what it's like to really care about someone for so many years. It's more than just a passing attraction or the romantic ideals you're so fond of telling me." Bruce's eyes flashed and he stepped forward. "You sound like an old man, Arthur. Maybe that's why you lost her." Arthur felt a surge of anger, but remembering the presence of Hannah and his grandson, he pulled himself together and stepped back. Marion, meanwhile, looked at both men with pain and confusion. "Stop it, Bruce," she finally said, taking his arm and trying to stop him. "Let's not make a scene, please." Arthur, gathering all his composure, turned to Hannah. "Hannah," he said softly, "I don't know what will happen next, but I want you to know that I will always be there for you and little Tom. No matter what decisions your mother makes." Hannah clung to him, feeling his strength and care. "Thank you, Daddy. I always knew I could count on you." As the festive evening drew to a close, Arthur felt a final clarity in his heart. He took one last look at everyone. Hannah was there, happy with her husband and baby, her eyes glowing with gratitude for him. Marion, on the other hand, stood sorrowful and aloof, her thoughts seeming to hover far away from him, where she belonged next to Bruce. Arthur pulled out his phone and looked at the pictures he'd taken recently in Chicago, remembering Julia, her words about change being a way to know oneself. He realized that there was a life ahead of him that he hadn't yet known, and a freedom that he had finally found. "Goodbye," he said quietly, though no one in the room heard it. A few days after that ill-fated Christmas, Arthur finally made his decision. He met with his lawyer, Mr. Goodman, to begin the divorce proceedings. 30 years of marriage seemed like a long-forgotten page in his life, and now Arthur wanted to close it once and for all. After the new year, Arthur began to prepare for the move. He arranged a meeting with management and discussed the possibility of transferring to another office in another state. Everything went according to plan, his request was approved, and he was to leave the city where he had lived all his life. He was finally gaining the freedom he had long dreamed of experiencing. The evening before he left, Hannah invited him to dinner. He knew this meeting was meaningful to her. Hannah realized that her father wasn't just leaving, he was leaving their lives. Time flew by and Arthur was standing on the doorstep of her new home. Hannah greeted him with joy and a touch of sadness. "Daddy, come in," she said, hugging him. "We're all so happy to see you." He stepped inside and saw Frank, his son-in-law, waiting for him with his son in his arms. Frank held out his hand and then handed him the baby. "Here you go, Arthur, here he is, your little Tom." Arthur smiled as he looked at his grandson. The child smiled back, holding out his small hands to him, and Arthur felt something warm and touching respond to his heart. "Hello, little Tom," Arthur said softly, rocking the baby fondly in his arms. "I think you've grown up a lot these past few weeks." "He's really growing up fast," Hannah nodded, watching the baby with pride. "I'm glad we're going to have your house so he can grow up in the same place I grew up. You can't imagine how important that is to me." Arthur nodded, realizing that this was one of his best decisions. Her home, her family, it was all a symbol of his past that now lived on in her future. They sat at the table enjoying dinner and discussing his plans for the move. But soon Hannah touched her father's hand and looking into his eyes said, "Daddy, are you sure you want to leave? I just can't imagine not having you around." Arthur looked at his daughter, realizing that his departure was indeed a difficult one for her. "Hannah, I've been thinking about this for a long time," he replied, holding her hand. "It doesn't mean I'm leaving you forever. I'm just starting a new phase of life that has been waiting for me for a long time. I will always be by your side even if I am physically far away. We will always have a connection and you know it." She nodded, trying to hide her tears. Arthur put his arms around her and said softly, "You're strong, Hannah. You have a beautiful family and I know you'll get through this." They sat together until late afternoon, discussing the future, plans and memories. Finally, it was time to say goodbye. Frank shook Arthur's hand firmly and thanked him for his home and support, and Hannah gave him another hug. "Take care of yourself, Daddy," she said, looking into his eyes with a smile and longing. "And don't forget to write to us." "I will," Arthur replied, nodding. "You have everything you need to be happy. I'm very proud of you." The next morning Arthur had all his things packed and was ready to move. He looked around the house one last time, trying to remember it as it had been all these years. It had been their nest, the home where he and Marion had spent the best moments of their lives. But now it all seemed distant, like an old movie, and he wanted to get away soon. He got in his car and headed to the airport to leave for his new life. In his new city, Arthur decided to find a place to live first. The local realtor he had arranged with over the phone met him on the spot and gave him a tour of several apartments. After some thought, Arthur settled on a cozy little apartment, with windows overlooking the park and a quiet neighborhood around it. "Excellent choice, Mr. Bennett," the realtor said, smiling. "It will be very comfortable. I'm sure you'll love it." "Thank you," Arthur replied, feeling the warmth of her words spread through his body. For the first time in a long time he felt that he was in a place where he felt really good. The first few weeks passed unnoticed. Arthur gradually settled into his new apartment, got to know his colleagues in the new office and immersed himself in his work. He felt like he was at a new stage of life, lonely but free, without the burdens that had accompanied him for the last few years. One evening he was sitting in a small cozy coffee shop not far from home when he heard a familiar voice. "Arthur?" He turned around and saw Julia, the same woman he had met at the conference in Chicago. She was as elegant and friendly as the first time. "Julia?" he replied in surprise, smiling. "What a meeting." She walked over to his table and sat down across from him, looking at him with genuine joy. "I didn't think I'd meet you here. You live in another city, don't you?" "I used to," he corrected, a little embarrassed. "I moved recently. I wanted a fresh start." Julia nodded understandingly and ordered a coffee. "I understand, Arthur. Change is sometimes as necessary as air. How do you like your new life?" Arthur thought for a moment, looking into her warm eyes. "It's not easy, but it's what I had to do," he admitted. "I feel lighter than I have in years. It's probably the first time in a long time that I feel free." Julia smiled. "I'm very happy for you, Arthur. You know, I've always believed that change is an opportunity to discover a new side of yourself." They talked all evening, discussing everything from their plans for the future to their shared memories of the conference. Arthur was surprised at how easy it was for him to be with her, No tension, no unnecessary words. At one point he caught himself thinking that perhaps their meeting had been more than just a coincidence. Julia looked at him with a slight smile before she parted. "Arthur, if you don't mind, why don't we meet again? It would be nice to spend time with you again." Arthur felt his heart sink. He realized that his life had changed and that he was on the threshold of something new. "Of course, Julia," he replied, smiling. "I'd be only too happy to." They exchanged phone numbers and said goodbye, each going their separate ways. Arthur returned home, feeling that something new was beginning in his life, perhaps better than he could have expected. Sitting in the silence of his apartment, he opened his phone and reread old photos with Marion. He no longer felt the bitterness he had before. Instead, he felt gratitude for the years they had spent together, and for the fact that he was now free to start his life anew. This time, Arthur was ready to move forward, knowing that the past would be the past, and the future would be only as he made it. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.